This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to today's IIEA webinar. I'm Seamus Allen, a researcher here at the IIEA. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Nina Jankowicz, the CEO of the American Sunlight Project and the author of How to Lose the Information War. Nina is going to speak to us for about 20 to 25 minutes on the topic of disinformation and the threat that it poses to our democracy and to our shared reality. We'll then go to a discussion and to a Q&A. You can join the Q&A using the button at the bottom of the screen. The event today and the Q&A are both on the record. Nina, as I mentioned, is the CEO of the American Sunlight Project, an initiative that she founded to counter the threat of disinformation. She's also previously the director of the Disinformation Governance Board at the US Department of Homeland Security. Before that, she was a global fellow at the Wilson Center, and she's also previously advised the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry on strategic communications. She's the author of 2 books, including How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict, and she's also the author of How to Be a Woman Online. Nina, thank you so much for joining us today. We're delighted to have you. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for inviting me to join you today. I am really delighted to be speaking with you all. I just wish I were with you in person. I've still not made it to Dublin, so one day.
Maybe in the future.
I hope so. Hopefully for fun reasons, not for leaving my country reasons, but we'll get to that. All right. So as I begin, I want to dispel the notion, one that really seems to have taken over American politics lately, that disinformation is something we should simply accept or something that's a normal part of politics. Disinformation, which the kind of agreed upon definition is the use of false or misleading information spread with malign intent. Disinformation is dismantling democracy here in the US and around the world. In late February, we marked 3 years since Vladimir Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a bloody and senseless war of Russian aggression built on a worldwide disinformation campaign. At home, over the past decade, we've seen millions of individuals taken in by disinformation, closing the already shrinking gap between the online and the offline. Disinformation narratives have endangered public health, falsely claiming that the coronavirus wasn't real or that COVID vaccines contained microchips meant to track us. And they've endangered public safety, storming the US Capitol on January 6th. Adherents of the QAnon conspiracy theory have engaged in violence. And of course, during the 2022 midterm elections, not to mention our most recent presidential elections here in the States, 60% of voters who believed that the 2020 election was stolen had a candidate who denied the results of that election on the ballot. 60% of voters had election deniers on the ballot. And of course, we now have an election denier as our commander-in-chief. My own life has been changed markedly by disinformation. If not for a disinformation campaign against me and the working group that I was meant to lead within the Department of Homeland Security, my family wouldn't have been violently threatened, and I would likely have served in government through the end of the Biden administration. At its core, I believe that disinformation is antithetical to democracy. We need good information to participate in the democratic process, and those who traffic in disinformation are knowingly dismantling it. My own experience over the past 3 years shows that this is a truth nearly a decade after revelations about Russian interference in the 2016 election came to light. The West seems not to fully understand. And that's why I wrote my book, How to Lose the Information War. It travels to the front lines of this conflict, the information conflict, in Central and Eastern Europe, and interviews the folks who have been in this battle much longer than we in the West have. I'm going to tell you 2 stories today. One is from the Czech Republic, and it should be a warning to governments attempting to combat disinformation through content-based fact-checking initiatives. The second is the story of my own experience at the center of a disinformation campaign. which demonstrates how the US government did not take this problem seriously and how partisan disinformation undermines democracy and inspires hate for our fellow citizens. It's a warning that I really hope you in the EU will heed. These types of campaigns have already begun to come after your institutions too. Ultimately, these two stories speak to an important point. Disinformation does not just come from outside of our borders. This problem is increasingly inside the house. Political parties and influencers use these tactics, the tactics of foreign adversaries, to influence debate. We are doing our adversaries' work for them, and we're becoming less free in the process. Now, I noticed early in my career that there's a uniquely American hubris to the United States approach to disinformation, particularly of the Russian variety. We seem to think that we were the first people this happened to, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. Of course, the Soviet Union was involved in propaganda and active measures campaigns throughout the communist period. But in the internet era, Russia has auditioned and perfected its tactics in nations like Estonia, Georgia, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Ukraine. I was in Ukraine working as a strategic communications advisor in Ukraine's Foreign Ministry during the 2016 election and its aftermath. While I was there, it became clear that while we in the West have been slow off the starting block, unable to recognize the dividing lines in our societies that disinformation weaponizes, and unwilling to admit that our fellow citizens themselves draw them, Russia has us lapped. Its goal is increased global influence, but Russia's disinformation campaigns operate on an undeniably human level, often employing local actors to cast a spell of plausible deniability and increase the authenticity of their message. The West's response, however, exists almost entirely in two realms. The government realm so far has consisted of fact checks and sanctions and taskers and talking points, while in the technology realm, executives for years, until very recently, believed in content curation and moderation and furious games of whack-a-troll, which I refer to as the removal of fake accounts created by malign actors, only to see others pop up again. Now, like the carnival game of whack-a-mole, whack-a-troll is all but unwinnable. Neither tech platforms nor governments nor journalists can fact-check their way out of the crisis of truth and trust that Western democracy currently faces. Keeping people at the heart of Western policy on foreign influence campaigns and broader disinformation is critical not only in responding to online offensives like Russia's, but in repairing the cracks in our democracies that allowed them to begin in the first place. If we don't, our efforts will become another cautionary tale and another example of how to lose the information war. Unfortunately, I think we're already quite close to that. Our allies in Central and Eastern Europe began fighting disinformation long before we in the West even recognized it was a problem, and they weren't always successful. In the Czech Republic, during the migrant crisis that drove hundreds of thousands of refugees into Europe, Russia used Islamophobic rhetoric and disinformation as its wedge issue, which sadly resonated with many Czech citizens. Russian disinformation claimed that because of the migrant crisis, pork was no longer being served in Czech schools, which of course is a cardinal sin in the Czech Republic. And they also claimed that the Czech Republic was unsafe because of the influx of potential terrorists through its borders. The hitch was that most migrants to the Czech Republic at that time were from nearby Slavic countries like Ukraine. They weren't from the Middle East. And in a recent census, more Czech people listed their religion as Jedi Knight, a full 15,000 individuals, than Islam, which only 11,000 people claimed. Yet those narratives from Russia still found fodder. Negative opinions toward Arabs skyrocketed in public opinion polls. And the Czech government felt they had to do something to combat these narratives. So they set up the Center Against Terrorism and Hybrid Threats within the Interior Ministry. Now, hybrid threats is one of these poorly defined concepts that tends to cloud the counter-disinformation arena. The Czech Republic defined it as, quote, a way to wage a confrontation or a conflict that represents a wide, complex, adaptable, and integrated combination of conventional and unconventional means, overt and covert activities, characterized primarily by coercion and subversion that are executed by military, paramilitary, and various civilian actors. So essentially, hybrid warfare can be anything and everything that a government wishes it to be, causing difficulties, understandably, for anyone who seeks to combat it. Now, the Center Against Terrorism and Hybrid Threats was announced to great fanfare across Western media. The Guardian heralded Czech Republic to fight fake news with specialist unit. The Irish Times wrote, Czechs launch an anti-propaganda unit with a close eye on Russia. Now, other than the center's long and cumbersome unofficial name, nowhere in that public fanfare was any emphasis placed on the hybrid threats, such as Islamophobia, that the center was founded to address. And the center's director told me in my research that that's exactly what they were meant to do. Debunk stories that had to do with the Ministry of Interior's mandate, not necessarily those only coming from Russia. This focus on Russia turned then Czech President Miloš Zeman against the center, even though he had signed measures to approve its creation and appointed the interior minister who created it. He was a member of Zeman's own political party. In addition to making a number of pro-Russian statements over the course of the year leading up to the center's founding, Zeman singled out the center in his annual Christmas address, drawing on sensitivities from the not-so-distant communist era in the Czech Republic. He said, "We do not need censorship. We do not need an idea police." His commentary reflects the role that history played in the debate surrounding the Center Against Terrorism and Hybrid Threats. Czechs are loath to give up their hard-won right to free speech, which is what some assumed the center was going to be doing with its efforts to debunk internal disinformation. Some Czechs, including Zeman, even asserted the center would have a button to turn off the internet. Now, the center soldiered on, even though it was stymied by the public misconceptions surrounding its launch. It focused its attention inward, educating civil servants, rather than those debunking activities that it had planned. But its supporters had really muddied its mandate and squandered precious public support when they did not communicate clearly about what it was meant to do. More than a year after its momentous launch that I wrote about in my book, it publicly really had little to show for itself. Islamophobic and anti-migrant rhetoric still ran rampant in the Czech Republic, with little course correction from the center. And what modest forays it did take into fact-checking seemed to have little effect. What's more, the center's work and the early criticism it faced did little to build public awareness about disinformation writ large. Alternative media, which publishes disinformation frequently in the Czech Republic, enjoyed a growing readership. And according to one Czech journalist I interviewed, quote, most people don't care or they don't know what the background of the sites they visit is. They consume information, but they don't know what type of information they consume, end quote. Now, I tell this story because I mentioned the Czech experience to my boss at the Department of Homeland Security within a week of starting my job. In March 2022, 3 years ago, I had just been appointed by the Biden administration to lead DHS's new Disinformation Governance Board, an admittedly very poorly named group that was meant to coordinate and inform the department's activities in the counter-disinformation space. Now, DHS is a real Frankenstein of a government department. It includes everything from our disaster management folks to our customs and border protection to our cybersecurity unit and much, much more. This intra-agency working group, which had no law enforcement authority, no budget, and no full-time staff other than myself, was meant to herd cats. I told my boss that the Czechs were a cautionary tale in a much, much less polarized environment than our own. I didn't want our benign cat herding efforts to corral policy ideas in the department to be taken out of context or politicized. We were going to be making recommendations for how to protect civil rights and civil liberties, as well as freedom of speech and privacy, while still addressing disinformation. We needed to communicate transparently and proactively about our work. We didn't want to end up like the Czechs. Instead, because the department did not take my advice, we ended up much worse. In late April 2022, after 8 weeks of my own internal lobbying, the board and my position were finally announced in a Washington email newsletter, Politico. Within hours, the patently false idea that the board was an Orwellian ministry of truth and that I was President Biden's chief censor were trending on social media, despite the fact that the board could not and would not be restricting or arbitrating speech at all. Were that the case, I would not have taken the job. But the facts did not matter to those using the board and my appointment as a political football. Within days, my personal life became a matter of intense intrigue and speculation. I became the young, female, easy-to-dunk-on public face of an alleged censorship effort. Tucker Carlson recklessly claimed that I had men with guns at my disposal to tell Americans to shut up. My professional reputation, which to that point had been characterized on both sides of the aisle by reasonable, careful analysis and respectable bipartisan work, was undermined. My analysis of counter-disinformation approaches that protected national security and freedom of speech was ignored. Congressional Republicans and right-wing media characterized me as an unhinged, partisan, unserious, dangerous fascist. I received an onslaught of online abuse, and my family, including my unborn child, I was 8.5 months pregnant at the time, were threatened. Within weeks, the department had made the decision to pause the board's activities, and I made the subsequent decision to leave an organization and administration that had no longer seemed willing to or able to stand up to industrial strength lies. During my time at DHS, I was bound by the department's communications policy. I was unable to speak up for myself and my past work as I was being personally defamed and subject to the very disinformation I had spent my career attempting to fight. It felt like being buried alive. The depictions of me with which many Americans became acquainted, of me as an evil big sister, as Biden's all-powerful disinformation czar, bore no resemblance to reality, in which I was one of thousands of political appointees with relatively little decision-making power. But those false narratives and the campaign against me were representative of a larger phenomenon within American political discourse, in which members of Congress, pundits, and anonymous internet trolls gleefully projected their own false depictions of me and the job that I was hired to do. They leveraged this fear not only to score political points against the non-existent ministry or the Biden administration, but, as some explicitly admitted, to try and run me out of public life entirely. The US government didn't know how to deal with the disinformation campaign against me or the harassment that I endured. Instead of mounting a response to the falsehoods and the hate speech, DHS and the administration essentially rolled over. They issued a mealy-mouthed fact sheet days too late and sent the Secretary of Homeland Security and the White House spokesperson on the defensive. Later, they kowtowed to the unfounded criticism. They put the board on pause, launched a review of the mission, and eventually announced that they concluded there was no need for a Disinformation Governance Board. Since that first victory for the so-called free speech crusaders, dozens of other researchers and organizations, including academic institutions, have come under legal, financial, and public attack for their work attempting to inform the public about the pollution of our information ecosystem. The attack has worsened, of course, during the second Trump administration, with the US government not only going after American nonprofits and academics, but threatening to withhold security assistance to Europe if the EU does not rethink its own regulations on online safety and countering disinformation. So, as a veteran of these wars, let me give you a couple of pointers. Because if there's one thing I want you to remember from today, it's that these attacks are coming for you too. First, for academics, researchers, and government entities that may be in the line of fire, please remember that staying silent is truly not an option in the internet era. I was repeatedly told that everything will blow over, don't worry about it, on Monday it'll be fine, while my life was being destroyed. 3 years later, I still get regular violent threats online. Now, I'm not saying correcting the record is going to solve your problem entirely. It can stem the flow, and it's important for legal issues, which I'll get to in a second. In my case, DHS waited far too long, days, to even try to correct the record. And by that point, it was too late. In the world of the internet, that may as well be eons. Second, think about the affordances that the legal system offers in pushing back on the attacks on reality against you and your colleagues. The hucksters who gain power and profit from lies are using the law to legitimize themselves and their narratives. It's critical that we push back on these attacks with things like cease and desist letters and defamation cases. I decided to sue Fox News. If the law doesn't work when individuals' lives are upended by lies, why does it exist? Now, third, to those of you who may be listening from the policymaking or regulation space, if you were setting up a government body to address disinformation and online harms, think deeply, very early and often about how you transparently and clearly communicate your goals from the very start. Have a crisis comms plan in place to respond to those inevitable attacks. Red team every piece of information that you put out there. And fourth, the simplest but perhaps most difficult advice, hold your ground. Now is the time for us all to stand up for democracy in reality. Don't mince your words. Our allies in Central and Eastern Europe never squirmed under pressure from the Kremlin. They stood strong, and it's our turn to do the same. More broadly, beyond the specific attacks on the counter-disinformation field, and particularly with the advent of artificial intelligence that is accessible and democratized, governments need to invest more robustly in information literacy. This is the big thesis of my book. We need to build up citizens' abilities to navigate a confusing information environment. We've seen time and time again that efforts to counter disinformation through the removal of speech, the very thing that my detractors accuse me of being in favor of, although I've never condoned it, these efforts are ineffective. Our allies in Central and Eastern Europe know this. They know that they can't hermetically seal their information environments to counter disinformation. Instead, they have invested in building up their citizens' resilience and filling in the fissures that allowed disinformation to flourish in the first place. In his own way, Thomas Jefferson recognized this as well, and he wrote in 1820, "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education." Thank you again for having me today. I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.